My name is Craig Call. I'm the Executive Director of the Utah Land Use Institute. Welcome you here, and we certainly appreciate our panelists, John Jansen, Chris Nelson, and Wendy Fisher, who will join us online. We appreciate the topic. This is related in a series of seminars to something that we need to do to address the housing crisis, the housing affordability crisis in our state. And you wonder, how does this relate to housing costs? One of the things we need desperately is more housing. And so in order to make that more palatable to the people who care a lot about our communities and the character of our communities, one of the ways we can try to accommodate our growth that's necessary is to make it as attractive and workable, practical, and efficient, and culturally sensitive, climatically sensitive as we can. So the tools we're talking about here have a real opportunity to do that, to help us grow in a way that preserves community character. And we appreciate all the work that's gone into this by John and Chris and Wendy and others. We thank those who are sponsoring our event, the Housing and Community Development Division of the Department of Workforce Services, the Office of the Property Rights Ombudsman, Department of Commerce, who are funding this in part through the 1% tax on building permits. We appreciate the Southern Utah home builders that have helped us host this and helped with our registration and refreshments. Let's say the Utah Bar Association that helped get the people together here today. The American Planning Association, which is providing credits. And speaking of credits, there are credits available for those who are participating, for attorneys and for planners and planning commissioners today. And we hope you'll take advantage of the opportunity to sign up for that. So anyway, I hope that's enough of the busyness before we get started. I would like to mention, however, that for those that are present, you should have picked up three pieces of information. One of them is the material for this seminar on transferable development rights. And you're also able to pick up a copy of Ground Rules, our compliments. Those viewing online, this is available on Amazon. Shameless commercial plug. For the Utah Land Use Institute. All proceeds, of course, go to the nonprofit institute. With that, we really appreciate our moderator, John Jansen, who will take it from here. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Craig. And thank you all for being here. Really appreciate that there's nobody in the front row except for Carson. Okay, because anybody here is going to really have trouble with their necks. Okay, looking up here the whole time. So, with that intro, Craig, appreciate that because we do want to tie this to housing. We are going to talk about a variety of tools today, but the emphasis is TDR, which I just have to go. Who can tell me what that means? TDR. I heard it.
Transferable development.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we're also going to talk about land trusts and conservation easements, but then a variety of other ones too. But the two primary are TDR and land trusts. So, move on here. Panelists, Craig introduced them. This is Chris. And I'm going to do a shameless plug for your book, which I know you're going to do too. So he has a book called the TDR Handbook. Could be called the TDR Bible. Oh, no, I don't know. Anyway, great resource for everybody if you're interested in transfer of development rights. Wendy, who I hope is online somewhere, she is the executive director of the Utah Open Lands organization, a nonprofit that has thousands and thousands of acres that they have preserved across our state. So she's going to talk to us about preservation tools. Then you got me. Not sure what I put this picture in here for, other than I am a skier. How's that? Okay. So here's our intent. Talk about TDR, land trusts. We're also going to talk about purchase of development rights. We're going to talk about overlays that you might use in your community. cluster zoning, and flexible agricultural zones. Altogether, those are some of the better tools out there for preserving your community character, and they do involve housing a lot, so we'll keep going. I've been fortunate enough in my career to do a lot of consulting in the last 12 or 13 years. And one of the recent projects I was working on was TDR for Nibley. And we have at least one Karina person from Nibley, maybe another, and I'm not sure who else. But anyway, we had as part of our process a discussion with developers and a discussion with farmers leading into the TDR educational process. And during that time, I thought I had the ultimate slideshow and was ready to go. And then the mayor walked in, and he said, "Can I have just 5 minutes?" And I thought, okay, yeah, sounds good. And the mayor said, and he had this great intro that was like, what is going on with our state? You know, are we tired of winning? What does that mean? We're winning at all these things. We're winning on our economy. At the time, we were winning on the increasing housing prices. We're winning on jobs. We're winning on population growth. All of these things, right? But are we tired of that? As he was doing that intro, he said, you know, in my town, here's what I hear. We need to conserve open space. So their town has a lot of farmland in it, okay? Want to conserve open space. We want to preserve our rural heritage, okay? How do we do that? How do we keep all those fields from turning into subdivisions? Good question. Built some attainable housing. For them, they've been on the half-acre mode for an awful long time and finally realized that the kids can't buy those homes. They can't buy those lots, okay? We need to do something different. And then the last thing is he just said, we don't want to raise any taxes. We're always told we can't raise taxes, but then we're told we got to do all these things that we can't afford because we don't have enough taxes. So anyway, it was a great little intro. The graph to the right, yep, that's right, actually is a survey that Envision Utah did over a couple years ago. Anybody here from Envision? Don't see them, maybe online. Which kind of indicated that we're not quite as happy with growth as we have been in the past. You can see there's a little more blue, or less blue on the one side and a lot more orangey red there on the other side. And that's really the whole graphic there. Issues with growth. I think we are hearing more about that. So let's talk about TDR for a moment, and then I'll turn this over to Chris. TDR has been around a long time, okay? Way back in the 40s, I think it was the 40s. Yeah, Grand Central Station in New York, anybody ever heard of that? Okay, it's where, 60s, okay, see? That's why he's gonna talk about TDR, not me. Anyway, so it was privately owned. This is where the trains come in to New York. It's a huge transit hub, great iconic building. Owners of the building wanted to build over it. They even thought about knocking it down, for that matter. And they worked out a system where they transferred the development rights for the above the station area, the air rights, to another building and gave that building more density. Since that time, we've had lots of programs across the country saving open space. Chris will talk about a variety of other nuances that are happening with TDR. We've got local examples in our state, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. And I'll just maybe emphasize this, that the success depends on the market and a well-constructed program. With that, I'm going to turn that over to the author of the handbook. There you go.
Yes, we're gonna dance. Thank you, John. I'm going to put this over here, see if it works. Yes, now you all go out and buy my book, and you all pay me some royalties. All the royalties go to a student scholarship fund at the University of Utah. So buy many and give them out as Christmas presents. So I'm going to go over some of the basics of transfer of development right programs, theories, nuances, and implications and pitfalls and everything else. So, but we first start with the idea, oops, I need mine. Let's do a little definitional thing here. So, a transfer of development right assumes you have the right to develop, right, on property, and that you are moving that right to develop to another property that is allowed to take that development to that property. Those are two different concepts, but they have to work together. So we have a transfer of development rights from open space commonly to a developing area. And money then is transferred from the developing area. Typically, a developer will buy the development rights. So the landowner gets compensated for not building on their property, but having their development right materialize someplace else. And then we have a cash transfer. It is slick. It's wonderful. It works. So why am I here? I'm here because it's not all those things. It's not easy to do. Most of these programs do not work. In our book, we go through hundreds of examples of programs that are designed but never really take off because they're complex, they're expensive, and they're confusing to the developers, landowners, and so forth. So I'm going to talk about some of the principles of what TDRs are, talk about the theory. There's actually a theory of TDRs, economics, planning, and implementation. But first I want to go over some examples of what TDRs can do when they work. So for example, this is in, these photographs are from my co-author, Rightt. He's very active in the TDR business. He's based in California, but he's a national character. So actually, if you need help putting TDRs together, talk to John and talk to Rick. Testing. Can you hear me? Is this on? I can't hear it. Not really. It's not on. One second. Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ah, here we go. Even I can hear me. Oops. I can hear myself feedback too. Okay, so Rick has a lot of history in this. So these photographs are from him, and many are from his projects, though not all. This is open space preservation in San Luis Obispo, California. Development rights were transferred from this farm area to the urbanized area of San Luis Obispo. Here's a horse. I don't know if it's a moving TDR, but the horse is there because the land was preserved for the TDRs. King County, Washington has the nation's largest TDR program. This is the, this is some preserve, I forget the name of it, but it's outside of Seattle, Washington. Thousands of acres of land are preserved through a TDR program. And actually the TDRs belong to King County, and they sell the TDRs to developers in target areas. I'll talk about that in a few minutes, how that works. New Jersey Pinelands, very famous, one of the earlier 1960s, 70s TDR programs to preserve wetlands and open spaces in the southern part of New Jersey. Larimer County, Colorado, where the ducks are. This area was preserved through TDRs, and this farm area, Gallatin County, Montana. You get a sense that these are all over the country. And then we have Palm Beach County, wetlands. We have a TDR program in Tahoe Regional Park, Regional Planning Agency. As people are moving development away from scenic views and vistas and moving them towards the urbanized areas. But, you know, it doesn't have to be just all open space either. So here's a historic building. As John was mentioning earlier, the Grand Central Station would have been knocked down but for a TDR program that New York City put together. This building in Seattle would have been knocked down, but for a TDR program that allowed the developer, the owner of the property, to take the air rights above the building and move them to someplace else. I'm guessing that's where they were moved, but I don't know for sure, frankly. So the TDR concept can be applied to a wide range of things. Preserve open space is maybe the most commonly done. Protect wildlife habitat, maintain rural character. So New England states will use TDR programs to preserve the small town-ishness of New England by preserving the land immediately around the towns and putting the TDRs in the town itself. And actually, a good friend of mine did this in Pennsylvania. Oh gosh, I'm having a moment here. The most famous Amish community in Pennsylvania. Help. Well, you're no help either. Anyway. Yeah, I'm sorry. Somebody had... Lancaster, yeah, thank you. So Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, has a county-wide TDR program and a county-wide urban growth boundary. So you can't, if you own a farm in Lancaster County, you can't build on the farm, but you can sell your TDRs to be used in any number of communities in the county. And the county has its own TDR bank. So the county will actually buy TDRs and then sell them to developers, and that actually generates a cash flow for the program. But then we can use TDRs for historic preservation. I mentioned that earlier. Low-income housing. So in some communities, they actually give a TDR bonus and sell the TDRs to infill redevelopment projects in exchange for having those projects be committed for low or moderate income housing. That's done. It's not often, but it's done. Recreation and renewable energy. I'm going to have an idea I'll throw out later on in the slideshow about how we might be able to ramp up TDRs into ever new areas. So what is a development right? In real estate, we know that our property is comprised of what we call a bundle of sticks. So we have timber rights, we have the right to build homes, mineral rights, access rights, the right to sell. Depending on the ownership we have, we own the property down to the center of the earth. And we actually own the property above ground all the way until into the heavens. Those rights have been tinkered with over the years because you can imagine you can't impose a toll on airplanes flying over your property. So some of those air rights have been messed with over time. So development rights are defined as the right to use real property such as farmland in ways that differ from the current use. That's an official definition, and I couldn't do much better than that. So as I mentioned earlier, the basic concept of the TDR is you sell certain rights on your land that are used someplace else. So in this particular case, we have a farm here. It's called the sending site. We want to preserve the farm. We allocate the farm. In this case, 3 development rights. That's an issue we'll talk about. I'm going to raise it now. TDRs work when you allocate development rights to land that don't have any development rights per se until we tell them they have development rights. I'll talk about that momentarily, but so let's say we give this farmland 3 development rights. They can't build on their farm, but they can sell their rights to a developer who puts them over here. This is called the receiving site. So we need a sending site and we need a receiving site. That's basically all there is to it. And then there's usually, not always, but there's usually a cash transfer back and forth. TDRs are done best in a planning context. So this might be the sending area of a New England small town, or here's the small town. We want to have the development rights occur adjacent to the small town, preserve the farming area, expand the small town through annexation, and preserve rural character, but also meet local housing needs. So TDRs are enabled in several states. These are the states that are darker in color, including Utah, and all of New England and many other states. But just because you don't have an enabling act doesn't mean you can't do it. So, in fact, sometimes the enabling act gets in the way of doing an effective and efficient TDR program. I don't know how Utah's done, but I think it's pretty well greased here, as I understand.
It's incredibly basic.
Incredibly, that's probably a good thing. The more basic, the better. So here's the sort of one of the theoretical foundations of TDR programs, and it will apply to open space. Open spaces provide a large number of services to society: flood control, air cleansing, scenery, food and fiber for our use, and so on and so forth. The only problem, though, is that the market doesn't recognize these values. How much are you willing to pay for a piece of land that provides flood control? Nothing. I'm not going to buy land for flood control. It may provide flood control. What's that worth? But I'm not going to buy land for its flood control. So the market doesn't value certain features of land, and because the market doesn't value those features, the land is sold below a social value for development. So there's an area called ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are things like air cleansing, water pollution control, and so on and so forth. We need to find ways to create a proxy value for land that provides certain services. We're not there yet, and we might not ever get there. I might have some thoughts on that a little later on. But what we can do is we can create an artificial value to the landowner that says, okay, we don't want you to build on your property. In fact, we'll tell you can't build on your property. You can't tear down the Grand Central Station. But we'll give you the chance to sell fictitious development rights to developers who can use them in receiving areas. And in that way, we preserve the open space land, we preserve the social value of those open spaces. The landowner still owns the property. The landowner can still use the property for open space purposes. And then we move those development rights from where they are now to another place in urban areas through infill, redevelopment, and so on and so forth. Then something else happens. As we densify the urban area, our cost per residential unit for services goes down. Water goes down per unit, sewer goes down per unit, roads costs go down per unit. So we have actually a fiscal savings when we increase the density in urban areas, and we increase the density by transferring development rights from rural areas because we want to preserve the rural areas for other purposes. In a way, it's kind of a win-win. The landowners get paid off, and we have more efficient, in theory, we have more efficient development occurring in the city. So I kind of mentioned a lot of these things anyway. So what we're doing is we're creating an artificial value in the market for landowners in sending areas to use and developers in receiving areas to acquire. But just because we do a TDR program doesn't mean it's going to work. So here's a little example of the kind of the economic foundations we have to pay attention to. So let's assume that, I'll go from the top down. These are the number of lots we can have on a parcel of land, an acre of land, let's say. And so we'll walk through the market value steps in increasing density and find that point where TDRs won't work. So when you own a piece of land, you're going to if you have the chance to add another residential unit to it, you're going to make more money. Add 2 more residential units, you make even more money. So the developer is going to be figuring out at what point does my density cap my return, economic return. So if we have a single lot on 1 acre, that home on that lot would be worth $100,000, let's say. So the total value is $100,000. That's where we start with. But through a TDR program, I can add 1 more unit, let's say, so I get 2 lots they're worth $90,000 each. I get $180,000 total. I'm $80,000 better off than the previous, than the baseline, the base 1 acre lot. At 3 lots, they're worth now $80,000 each, total $240,000, but the difference goes down. So I only make $60,000 more with 3 lots than 2 lots. At 4 lots, we have $70,000 per lot, $280,000 in total revenue, but only $40,000 additional revenue. Down at 6 lots per acre, they're worth maybe $50,000 each. We get $300,000 total, but we don't get any new revenue from 5 lots. So 5 lots would probably be the maximum this developer would be willing to buy TDRs. So you see that, how that works? And of course, any higher density, it's not going to work. So here's a very interesting conundrum that planners find themselves in. In order to make TDRs work, you need to have a sending area properly designed and properly righted so you can sell the rights. But then you have to have a receiving area that is not able to maximize its market potential. So time and again, I've seen across the country, a local government will say, okay, let's just zone all this property at 6 units to the acre, right? That's pretty efficient. 6 to the acre, that's pretty efficient. But then the TDR program doesn't work because you can't add any more units because the developer doesn't make any more money. So then you have to cook the zoning to maybe make it 2 units per acre or 3 units per acre and force the developer to buy some TDRs to bring it up to 5 or 6. That's a little awkward thinking, I think. And it's not easy sometimes to get a city council or county commission to think in terms of throttling back zoning. And certainly from a planning perspective, the last thing I want to do is throttle back urban area zoning and reduce the number of potential homes, even though it's part of a TDR program. So there is this tension going on between good planning, trying to maximize open space preservation in this case, and trying to maximize urban development. And there's no easy answer to that conundrum, at least that I've found. So there are 4 key planning elements in TDR planning. We need to designate the area to be preserved. I'm talking mostly about open space preservation now. These are called the sending areas. Sometimes when TDR programs don't work, it may be that your sending area doesn't work properly. I'll talk about that, I think, in a slide or two. Then you need to designate a growth zone or the receiving area. And by the way, you need to do your planning to do this. So I have a little case study. It's in the book. Montgomery County, Maryland, which is north of D.C., Washington, D.C., has arguably the nation's best TDR program. It started in the 1970s. I actually was good friends with the person who started it all. And he was telling my students when I was at Virginia Tech then teaching, he was saying that the Montgomery County TDR program was held unconstitutional by the Maryland courts. But for a very interesting reason. The receiving areas were not properly planned to receive additional density. So in Montgomery County, if you were in a receiving area, you added 2 more units per acre to your density. But the planning code forgot to change the plan to allow these 2 extra units per acre. And so the planning code under Maryland law was inconsistent with the state constitution. That was an easy fix, but it still did delay them a full year before they implemented the program. Number 3, determine, if not create, a market for development rights. I just mentioned that you need to have, this is an exchange in the case of open space preservation. You need to be sure that your zoning in the receiving areas will encourage developers to buy development rights, and that the owners of development rights in the countryside are induced into selling their development rights. Now, again, let's look at Montgomery County, Maryland. I did a little study on this. Guess who would sell development rights in the farming areas early on in the program? Farmers way far away from urban development. If you are a farmer owning land right in the path of development, you're not going to sell your development rights because you might be the next piece of land annexed by the city for development. You'd be foolish not to. So the development rights would be sold from the least likely locations to be ever urbanized, which is the ones furthest away. Well, when all those early pickings were reduced and eventually the market worked itself towards the city centers, and now Montgomery County is pretty near out of development rights in the county. So we have to see what they're going to do next. And then define TDR procedures and transfer rights procedures. There's a whole cottage industry among lawyers, some planners, architects, landscape architects, I should say, that are around TDR programs to make them work. In some jurisdictions, they do the smart thing by having an over-the-counter, fully legally approved TDR transfer program. Otherwise, you need to have your own lawyer, title company, everything else, figure these things out. It can get expensive, and to the seller of TDRs, it could be not worth the bother. Then you need to have a whole list of things you need to put together to make TDRs work. You have to have authority. That's where the Enabling Act comes in handy. Although in states we don't have enabling acts, you can get the authority through home rule powers. So clarity of purpose. What are you trying to do? And is it pretty clear what you're doing and how you're doing it? You need to have the administrative resources. You need to have staff who knows what they're doing. Staff are important because they become the educators to the people in the sending areas and in the receiving areas. And oftentimes they become the brokers between the two parties. The program needs to be evasion-proof and it needs to be by right. Evasion-proof. So a developer has 15 development rights over here, and then somehow the developer, the landowner is able to get maybe 5 to 8 homes built on the property. That kind of undermines the purpose of TDRs. So that you have to make sure that TDRs are not going to be used actually on the property itself, and it needs to be by right. If you have to go through a conditional use process or variance or other process, you have the chance to kill the TDR rights. And so why would you want to have the TDRs to begin with? So you need to have it evasion-proof and by right. You need to have economic feasibility. So a lot of these TDR programs I've seen around the country, they hire economists. A good friend of mine is an economist based in Florida. He does these things for a living for a local government, so they know how to calibrate the zoning density and the TDRs in the sending areas to get the balance right, to get the market to work. I was on a case in Georgia where this didn't work, that the local city thought that they assumed there would be $100,000 per development right from the sending area. It turns out the market was only offering like $20,000 per development right. And they wondered why the program didn't work. The price wasn't high enough to induce the sellers of the development rights to participate. It needs to be simple. You need to reduce what are called transaction costs. That's what I mentioned earlier when some local governments have across-the-counter paperwork you fill out. It's more to it than that. You need a title report and other things like that, but at least to have the forms all ready to go for you to fill out and use. And then TDRs require that you actually create a TDR market, a commodities exchange or something. Now, if the TDR program is not effective, meaning you're not selling TDRs, you're not seeing increased density in receiving areas, you need to reevaluate your sending areas and or receiving areas and maybe do some recalibration. Maybe you need to improve the bonuses. Maybe the TDRs aren't big enough, numerous enough. And then here's something that a lot of places do that's actually quite effective: create a fee in lieu feature. So a developer can't buy TDRs. Sellers, the farmers are not selling at a price that the developer can afford to pay. Maybe the farmers are greedy, and some of them are. So what does the developer do? The developer will then say, cut a deal with the city or county and say, I will pay you $40,000 per TDR that I can't buy. I can't get them. But I'll pay the city $40,000 per additional residential unit on my property. So that's a fee in lieu of a TDR. And then the city or county will use that money itself and wait for the market to come down or change or whatever. And then they'll use that money themselves to buy the TDRs that the developer couldn't buy. And a lot of places do this instead of a TDR program that entails a direct exchange between the sending area owner and the receiving area owner. So in Washington County, in King County, Washington, the King County Board itself is very active in acquiring development rights and then selling them directly to developers who then pay a fee in lieu of development right. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this, and so I recommend exploring the fee in lieu option instead of the direct TDR transfer. But if none of those things work, if you can't do a fee in lieu program, you can't redesign the program, it's not working, just abandon the program. And that has happened more often than we think. So then some innovations in TDRs.
Can I jump into some questions?
Yeah.
Some general questions. Is this being done in Utah anywhere?
Hold on just a second. I'll talk about a couple of the programs, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, when I'm done, this is my last slide, by the way, so when I'm done, you can fire questions at me. We have, until 6 o'clock tonight, I think, Greg? No, there's a show after us, but we have until 3 o'clock. That's plenty of time. We have Wendy coming on, too. Anyway, so I threw out this idea, I don't know, 10 years ago now. So what if we had a TDR program, and what if we are able to use a TDR program to increase density and lower cost as a consequence? Maybe we can reduce our impact fees in the receiving areas because we are making it more efficient, less costly. Impact fees, as we all know in Utah, and Utah is actually a leader in impact fees, generates new money to put in new infrastructure needed to serve the needs of new development. But if that new development is efficient in certain locations where you have more efficiency with density, maybe the impact fees themselves can be reduced to reward the purchase of TDRs in the region. TDRs can be used to offset NIMBYism, not in my backyard. So maybe, nobody wants development in the neighborhood, but maybe there's a transit-oriented development, a TOD, over yonder, and maybe we get the neighbors to say, okay, what if we use TDR programs to preserve the farmlands, which they want to do, but we'll put the TDRs over there in the TOD, not in your neighborhood. People will sign up for that more often than not. I talked about the fee in lieu idea. I think that's where we ought to go in many cases. Now, Montgomery County did something very interesting many, many years ago, actually during the Great Recession. We all remember that, I'm sure. So home prices were falling, land prices were falling. Montgomery County, Maryland, then bought a whole bunch of TDRs from farmers willing to sell TDRs because they were hurt on their cash flow. So Montgomery County bought a whole lot of discounted TDRs during the Great Recession. And then about 2012, 13, 14, they began selling them at up to 10 times the price to developers who used the additional density to build more homes. And the county then used that additional revenue to go buy even more development rights. And so the county in Montgomery County and King County, Washington, they're very active in TDR acquisitions and sales. TDRs are not just the residential side, but we talked about that, not as much as we should, but there's a lot of non-residential opportunities for TDRs as well. And then we might reconsider how many TDRs we provide in historically significant areas or open space areas or whatever, because maybe we're undervaluing the value of TDRs in our community. So we might need to reconsider the role of TDRs in adding social value to the community, and in doing so, adding to the TDR base. So I'm going to stop here, and then John will follow me. But let's have some Q&A now while I'm still here. Yes, sir. Craig, over here. And then to get Craig exercise today, I'm going to have somebody over here.
Thanks. Just a question about interjurisdictional TDRs. So you mentioned local government, but you also mentioned a lot of county programs. And when you reference cities, I guess the assumption is that cities have these big open spaces.
Yes. Oh, that's that's a great question, and I have a good answer. Next question. The TDRs, unfortunately, are usually jurisdiction specific. So a lot of counties do it, but counties can only do it when they have urbanized areas that they control, which wouldn't be inside cities. So a city can do this, but they have to have open spaces around the cities so where they can actually implement the program and preserve open spaces within the city. That is one of the shortcomings of TDR programs. Now, most TDR statutes I know don't prevent cities and counties from negotiating, but I'm not sure I've ever seen one done. And maybe Utah's done this. Okay, well, John.
I'll just toss in, actually with your cohort, Rick.
Yeah.
I was involved in a project in Summit County, and the idea was that try to preserve the open space in Summit County, move it into the cities, okay? But the cities didn't trust the county, so that never worked. I've heard this is being...
I rest my case.
Yeah. Although I thought I'd read of one across the country somewhere.
I'm sure.
Because, if everyone is embracing this, we want to hang on to our farmland or our open space, then cities might cooperate, but there's obviously a lot of politics with that. Cache County, I understand, is discussing that. Anybody here from Cache County? Yep, I've heard that conversation up there. Again, a tough one, but most of the ones that I see are one local jurisdiction. So.
Actually, one does come to mind. I mentioned it earlier, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The county, it's a TDR program for the county. There's like 6 cities in the county, and they all mutually cooperate. So the cities have designated the receiving areas, and the county then designates the sending areas, and so it does work there. But that's sort of the exception that proves the rule. Next question?
Yes. I know that we talked a lot about the use of density as a TDR, but has there been examples of use? For example, I'm thinking of short-term rentals, having that as a development right that could be transferred from one to the other. My second question is, do you recommend that cities or these counties and organizations create like an online exchange for the facilitation of these transfer development rights and things like that? So.
That would be wonderful. Yes. And in fact, I'm surprised we haven't gone that direction with how slick the internet has become these days. I mean, real estate now is transacted on the internet. So why can't we do TDR programs on the internet? Okay, thank you all very much, and we'll have John coming up after me. Thank you.
I don't think so. So I think Chris has really covered most of these points that I have in here. I do want to kind of emphasize a couple of quick things, okay? There's a term, and I don't remember if I got this from the book or not, but zoning discipline, okay? So I just want to emphasize this idea that if the developer can get what the developer wants to build, TDR is not going to work, okay? I had experience with West Valley. I don't see any of my West Valley friends here, maybe online, but the council wouldn't go with a guaranteed right to develop based on transferring TDRs to a project. They wanted to negotiate, okay? Just doesn't work. The other one here is, you see that word right there, voluntary, okay? I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and you're going to hear me say that again and again. It's really hard to get across to everybody that it's a voluntary private market transaction. Farmer doesn't have to play, developer doesn't have to play. It's an option, okay? It's just really important to understand, and it's hard to communicate that. I'm going to go back to my nibbly friends for a moment, when we were talking about within a jurisdiction or outside of a jurisdiction, Nibley wants to offer that as a incentive to farmers outside of their current boundaries to come into the city, because you can come in the city and use TDR credits to preserve what you're doing on that property still, and yet get some money out of them via a developer. That was really hard for them to communicate. Okay, it was like, hey, government's coming in, another regulation, forget it, I don't want to talk to those folks. Why are they even talking about annexing me? You know, that kind of thing. So an interesting piece of this is communication. And just to emphasize the things that we hear, and we hear this for almost everything that we do, right, as communities involved in the development process. You get really concerned about things in meetings about height, okay? In that receiving area, what is that development gonna look like? I think Wilf stepped outside, but he was involved in a TDR in Davis County when he was the planning director there. And the end product that showed up, nobody liked in the receiving area, okay? It killed the program, basically, because they didn't have any standards for what would happen there. Density, obviously, you don't ever worry about density anywhere, do you? Yep.
So I live in Tokerville, and nobody wants anything to change. So like you might want to preserve the outside area, the more rural area, and bring things in, but that's already zoned a certain.
Yeah.
So I live in Tokerville, and everybody wants to everything to stay the same. They don't want the urban part of town to get any bigger. They don't want the rural part to change. So how do you'd have to change zoning inside of that. They've already built out to the zoning capability. So how does this TDR work? Do you change zoning, or how do you change? Does that make sense?
It does. And I don't know if we emphasize that enough, but the receiving area decision, okay, where are you going to put that density? Obviously you think about in your town center, your village, whatever it might be, somewhere in there, a new town center. Some communities have spread it out, so if you had half-acre lots, now you could go to quarter. Of course, if you only have septic tanks, that probably doesn't work. But that receiving area decision is a huge decision to make. Okay, where's that going to go? Because you're talking about density, right? And I don't know, everywhere I've been, everybody goes crazy over density. So it is something that you got to figure out in that process. Does that answer that one? Yep, okay. What else did I have there? Oh, this is the lead-in for Wendy. Now, how do we get Wendy on the virtual? We got that figured out? It's not up here. So one of the pieces we didn't really talk about is the long-term maintenance of these properties. If you think about just an open space on a bench in a creekside, maybe that's not a big deal. Got a trail in there, maybe those kinds of things, not too difficult. But for a farm or an orchard, how do you assure that long-term use continues? Now, a lot of times the farmers are really happy to continue and get some money at the same time, right? But some point in the future, there's an issue there, and so you've got a maintenance question. I think Wendy will talk about that in a minute. You had a question over here? Yep.
Yeah, you can probably hear me. I'm kind of loud anyway.
Okay. Or we can run your way.
Have these ever been used? You got a number of ranching and farming families that have parcels, of course, various spots inside the city, outside the city. That the family itself could sell itself its TDRs on more of the outskirt property, develop more densely on the interior property, and stay within a family rather than a developer?
Yes. But we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. That's more of what's called cluster zoning. There's a lot of different names for that. But the idea that if you got 100 acres, instead of, I didn't do that, instead of 100 acres of acre lots, you push all of that development down to one corner, maybe on 25 acres, okay? But you get 100 units to put on that 25 acres, okay? That is a fairly common zoning technique.
Maybe allow the property to stay in families and take care of the people who want to sell out, but still keep it as one.
Yeah, yeah. And there's advantages for communities for that, and I will go over that in a minute. Before Wendy, sorry, I am going to talk about the other communities in Utah that actually have done some of these things. So the biggest one is Mapleton. Does everybody know where Mapleton is, Utah County? Okay. So they have an area up on the bench that they wanted for an open space for trails. They started a program back in 1990, I can't read my writing, 8? Yes. And they were able to transfer from that area a ton of credits and move them into the rest of their community. And they've got 750 acres that they preserved. So I'll get my little test question. I think I asked this up in Logan too, but here you go. How many acres in a square mile? 640. I heard it over there. There we go. That's a huge area that they have preserved with TDR, okay? Ogden Valley, I think Craig might have been involved in this, but they're transferring from the valley to the east of Ogden City, up in the mountains, into the ski resorts, okay? So that's happening. Spanish Fork, I'm just gonna mention that one quickly. They're in the middle of this process, not done. But they have a great video, and I got a picture of one of those in a moment here. And then Nibley, they've just recently approved their TDR system. We'll see how that works. One of the things that I think is an interesting way to back into the how much is a credit worth is actually talking with your developers and saying, what are you willing to pay for another door, okay? For another unit, what are you willing to pay? And then you got to add up the credits, the theoretical credits for that farmer, right? To get to a point where that farmer is willing to sell those potential development rights, okay, based on that value that developers are willing to pay. Again, a voluntary thing. But up in Nibley, they've just passed that. Just a little more data on this one. They have an interesting little piece to this that I think is kind of nice. You think about a bench, okay? This is a bench that you want to hang on to, right? You want to put some trails in. You don't want to see development covering this whole place. They decided they wanted to hold the conservation easement, okay? And they gave extra credits if that land was dedicated to them. Okay? Another little nuance to think about, all right? But it's just one that they employed, and it worked. So, good example there. This is a picture of a piece from the Spanish Fork video. If you get a chance to look around on their site, it was a little hard to find, but it's really well done. Nice little program on it. So, again, let's talk about the permanency of this, okay? So you sell all those development rights, the theoretical ones, and somehow that property's got to be preserved on a permanent basis. And I think that's the cue for Wendy, if she's ready. She's ready. I got a thumbs up from Craig. What is the land trust? Wendy, are you there?
I am here. I appreciate being with all of you today. I think one of the things that I would like to start out with is to really kind of come back to a couple of things that the previous speakers have already mentioned. And one of those is, are we winning yet? And I think that the question we really need to ask ourselves is, what really makes up the winning hand? And I think that's what Utah really should be looking at. I've been doing land conservation with Utah Open Lands for 32 years. And the top two reasons in all of that time that people move to the state of Utah, visit for tourism, one of our cleaner industries, is because of its scenic beauty and recreational opportunity. And in fact, during the pandemic, when other communities, states, suffered from a downturn in their economy, Utah stayed strong and in fact rose by about 3%. And part of that really is attributable to the fact that we have these open spaces. Because let's face it, during the pandemic, people could get out in these open spaces and they could stay 6 feet apart. And in fact, during that time, we saw a 300% increase in the amount of use of our open spaces statewide, somewhat unprecedented. And I'll talk about some of the consequences to that, which I think a lot of communities need to think about once they do the conservation easement or protect some of this open space. But basically, what is a land trust? A land trust is a 501c3 nonprofit public charity, but we have a special designation being under 170H of the Internal Revenue Service Code, which the moment you mention the Internal Revenue Service, I'm sure people's eyes are glazing over. But there's a very specific discussion within conservation easements that a lot of people don't always pay attention to with respect to the 170H code, which land trusts, especially land trusts that are accredited through the National Land Trust Alliance, they pay a lot of attention to. And that is that to be a qualified organization under 170H to hold a conservation easement, you have to actually have the resources and the commitment to uphold the terms of the conservation easement. And we'll talk about a little bit about what a conservation easement is in a moment. But I think it's important to understand that typically conservation easements and land trusts are all vehicles by which communities are working to preserve, quite frankly, the things that they love about their communities. And to a great extent, a land trust becomes the steward of those open land resources. We talked a little bit about the ecosystem services that was mentioned. And that's part of winning too, right? If we want to win as a community, we probably need to protect the very reasons that people are coming to our state, coming to our community. Miles Rademan, who was the public affairs director for Park City long ago, talked about protecting the mountain resort character of Park City. And one of the things he used to say is because nobody wants to leave a suburb to come and recreate in a suburb. I think there are analogous situations for communities throughout. I heard somebody talk about the fact that in Tokerville, people want it to stay the same. That's a big part of why we are winning, is that we have these special landscapes, we have these community benefits. And yes, the ecosystem services, though maybe we're challenged in terms of how to quantify the dollar figure associated with those ecosystem services, we all get it. You've seen in other parts of the country, when the water system becomes tainted, people want to move out. When the air becomes unclean to breathe, people want to move out. So we can move on to the next slide, and just so you know, I can't see the slides. I can only see my name and title, so hopefully this is all coming through. For Utah land conservation in the state of Utah, I think it's important to understand, similar to the TDRs and the fact that in the state of Utah, we actually have, enabling acts that allow for the TDRs. In Utah, we do have enabling legislation for conservation easements. We have a conservation easement statute, came about in 1985. But one of the things that I think is important to understand is that concept of the value of these conservation easements. And I'm going to talk about the tax deductibility of conservation easements in a moment. But one of the things that Utah Open Lands recognized early on when we began protecting open space in the state of Utah, and to date we've protected 64,000 acres. One of the things that we recognized is that for a lot of these families, a lot of the land holding families in the state of Utah, a lot of them are farmers and ranchers. And farming and ranching is tough. It's not an easy job. And a lot of these folks are land rich, cash poor. And so if you're asking them to permanently keep that farm intact, for a lot of folks, this is the inheritance. This might be the retirement fund, so to speak. And so one of the things that we've looked at is whether or not there can be funding for these various different conservation easements. And so we were part of an agricultural task force way back in the late 90s that ended up resulting in the Leray McAllister Critical Lands Fund. That's now the Working Lands Fund. It was supposed to be funded to the tune of $3 to $4 million every single year. That hasn't happened. And it's a shame, actually, that we as a state haven't continued to fund our statewide open space fund. Not just because we recognize how important these open lands are to our communities and our long-term economic vitality, but I think the other thing that has become really obvious is that in communities where they have established open space bonds, they've actually been able to leverage their funding from the community 2 times, 3 times, and in one instance, conservation easement project we did in the Heber Valley up in Wasatch County, Midway City was able to leverage their open space bond dollars 10 to 1. But you've got to have that funding in place. You have to have local funding to match some of the federal programs. And right now, through the Farm Bill, the Natural Resource Conservation Service has a number of different funding options through their agricultural land easement program that can help augment local funding, but they like to see a match. They like to see a match in terms of a donated value from the landowner, and again, we'll talk about that in a minute, and also local cash match. So if we don't have an open space fund statewide, obviously that creates an issue. But there are many open space bonds that have passed in various different communities, and one of the most recent ones, I think John touched on a little bit, is the one that's passed in Cache County. So if we can go to the next slide. The types of conservation purposes, and it's important to understand these different types of conservation purposes with respect to even if you're enabling a TDR program and you want to see those open spaces protected in perpetuity. Because if you're going to utilize the tool of a conservation easement, you have to make sure that you're meeting what we call the conservation purposes test. So under Utah code, and also when you're looking at the IRS code from which we get the conservation easement legislation, there are various different conservation purposes. There's a scenic value. And that is actually, it can be agricultural land, but it has to be a scenic value that the public can see from some significant public roadway, maybe some public trails, maybe a national park that you can then see these agricultural, but it has to have a value to the public to see it. In other words, if you're standing on the property and you're looking out at the vista and that's really pretty, that's not the scenic value we're talking about. We're saying, does this property that you're protecting open up that scenic value? And then there's just general open land value, which is important when you're talking about protecting various different forests. There's also the clearly delineated government conservation policy. And I think a lot of people get confused because they think, well, agriculture is one of those conservation purposes. Actually, it is not defined within that 170H. Really, the agricultural is both the scenic value that it provides from a conservation purpose, and then also through various different programs. And of course, we have the Natural Resource Conservation Service, we have the Wetland Reserve Program. There are various different open space bonds that might prioritize agricultural land protection. And it's so those are the clearly delineated government policies by which we're working to preserve the agricultural land. In addition to that, we know that for agricultural land, for a lot of these landscapes, they also provide natural habitat and natural ecosystems. So those ecosystem services that we were talking about earlier, those are part of that natural habitat is part of what can be protected as part of the conservation purposes. And then there's registered historic landscapes. So on the East Coast, they've preserved battlefields. Typically that is a historic building on the National Register, but there are other historic land areas that can qualify. And then public recreation or education. And I want to really make sure that it's clear that you only have to qualify for one of the conservation purposes. So a lot of farmers and ranchers will ask me, oh my goodness, if I have the public out here with free reign on my property, it's going to be hard for me to farm. That's okay. You don't have to provide public recreation and education as one of the conservation purposes if you qualify, for example, for the clearly delineated government conservation policy. So let's talk about conservation easements, the next slide, landowner, how that works with various different landowners. And I want to bring this up because typically when you start getting into a TDR scenario, you're not really going to be working with the farmer and rancher as much as you're going to be working with an HOA or some other mechanism, maybe even with the town or the community municipality itself. So first, let's talk about conservation easements in the context of working with landowners. If you think about working with landowners and conservation easements, let's go back to that idea of the bundle of sticks that was brought up. When you look at a bundle of sticks, I think it's really easy for people to understand, especially here in the West, that you might not own the mineral estate. That might have been transferred off. You might not own water. Those are all sticks that comprise part of that bundle of sticks for a fee title ownership in a piece of property. What a conservation easement does, the way I like to look at it is, in order to preserve the open space, the agricultural working landscape, the natural habitat, or even trails and recreation, we know that subdivision and development, cookie cutter, kind of traditional subdivision that we see, is going to actually interfere with those conservation purposes that we identified previously. So what we do with a conservation easement, it's a legal binding agreement between a land trust and the landowner. And we basically take a big string and we tie up those development rights. So we're going to tie up the mineral development because obviously that would interfere. We're going to make sure the water is still attendant to the land if it's a working landscape and irrigated farmland. And we're going to tie up those subdivision and development rights, put a big bow around it, and our job as a land trust is to enforce the terms of the conservation easement forever. So it is a perpetual deed. Now, there are tax incentives, and earlier there was the discussion about how you value these. And I would agree that a lot of times we can't value the ecosystem services, although we are increasingly beginning to value that public recreation value even if you're not looking at it from a subdivision perspective. But typically the way that conservation easements are valued is to look at the fair market value with all of the bundles of sticks all in place. Or you could even think about it in terms of it being the entire pie, as opposed to different pieces of pie. But if you're again going back to the bundle of sticks, which we talked about earlier, it's that entire bundle that makes up the fee title. And that makes up the market value, which is largely determined by what a willing buyer is willing to pay a willing seller for a piece of property. And typically, those market values are set by how much development that property has. Now, I think it's important to understand that here again, in the transfer development rights scenario, when you start talking about how you're gonna plan and zone and provide additional rights, that gets really murky when you're starting to talk about how you're valuing, how you are appraising a conservation easement value. And we're gonna talk in a minute about the idea that you can't double dip. So I'll talk about that for just a second later. But one of the things that's really important to understand is that actually that conservation easement has a value that sometimes is actually expressed as a percentage of that fair market value. But it's really based on how many of those sticks, including how much of the development or how much of the subdivision have you basically tied up in the conservation easement. You've essentially, yes, removed it from the property, but you're not sending it someplace else. It's just tied up in the document and it's enforced by a land trust. Now, there are tax incentives for farmers and ranchers that qualify. There's actually 100% of their adjusted gross income against the value of the gift for 16 total years that they can use and take benefits from. But with a lot of these programs that I mentioned earlier in terms of being able to purchase conservation easements, we've engaged as an organization, and many land trusts will do this, in what we call a bargain sale. And that's something where we use some of these federal funds and even state and even community funds in order to basically tie up, get that fair market value of the conservation easement, so the fair market value with all of the bundle of sticks, then you take away the development bundle of sticks. The landowner makes a partial contribution, and then we pay the remaining amount by going to some of these various different programs. So if you look at the Natural Resource Conservation Service, especially if they're working with lands, agricultural working landscapes that they consider to be lands of significance, grasslands of special significance, oftentimes that is related to sage grouse or other species, they actually will pay 75% of the value of the conservation easement. Again, that's not 100% of the value of the land, and part of the reason for that is you get to own the land, but you're also getting paid a value for the restrictions that you're placing on yourself as a landowner. And, you know, from that perspective, I want to say that when it comes to preserving agricultural land in the community, I look at the Kohler family. So you can see this picture of the young kids with the various different cows. This is the home of the Heber Valley Artisan Cheese Shop. And those cows were the great-great-great-grandparents of the cows that the Kohler family has today. And the Kohler family worked with Utah Open Lands through this federal process that we went through, as well as garnering support from the Wasatch Open Lands Open Space Bond and the Midway Open Space Bond. And we actually purchased the conservation easement on this property. And it restricts them from ever subdividing or developing the property, but it allows them to continue to milk their dairy cows, to graze those cows, and to continue to have that working landscape agricultural production. But one of the reasons is we started looking at preserving farmland in the Heber Valley, that we started working with the Kohler family, because we really felt that in order to sustain agricultural working landscapes, you had to have what I would call an anchor tenant. An agricultural producer that's really successful in the area that if you preserve a farmland, an agricultural field over in this side of the valley, or you're even trying to create a larger grouping of these agricultural landscapes, that you're always going to have a farmer there that's going to continue to farm that area. And that becomes something that I think right now places like Cache County and other areas are struggling with, is how do you really sustain that agricultural economy moving forward? And we can talk about that. That's kind of not the subject of this particular presentation, but it is something to think about. Beyond that, when you start looking at TDRs, or if you're looking at even some of your agricultural producers, you have to look at who is going to be the next successive owner of that landscape. And you have to really think about, you might love the landowner you're working with right now, but as land becomes more and more scarce, these open spaces will become, in essence, kind of a final frontier, and they may be subject to people coming in and saying, well, let's put this on this open space because we have no place else to put it. Well, that wasn't the intent of the donor. That wasn't the intent of the open space bond monies. So that's what Utah Open Lands does. We defend these conservation easements in perpetuity, but we're looking at who those successive landowners are going to be. But because of that, one of the things that we do is we ensure that we also obtain stewardship funding for every single conservation easement that we take on. And that is so that we can both legally defend these and monitor the terms of the conservation easement, understanding the trajectory, the conservation purposes that are protected on the land over time. So that's really what we look at when we're looking at these various different landowners. And I would say 9 times out of 10, if you're working with a transfer development rights scenario, hopefully you've met the conservation purposes test, because you're ensuring that there's going to continue to be a reason to have that open space protected. But you are typically going to be working with a homeowners association that's going to end up being the owner of that open space. Same sort of thing when you have a cluster development in an area that's set aside as common area within the HOA. If you place that under conservation easement, those are going to be your successive grantors. And you need to think about that at the very beginning when you're working with a developer, because that's one individual. The moment it becomes a homeowners association, I can tell you it becomes a lot more cumbersome for a land trust organization. Moving on to the next slide, I think that one of the things that we have also seen that becomes really important when you're talking about TDRs and land trusts is I would encourage that at the time that you're starting to set up your TDR, similar to what the previous speakers both talked about, that you also maybe consult with a land trust. Not necessarily that you're going to use that land trust to hold the conservation easement, but I think it is important to understand whether or not at the end of the day, the land trust feels like they're going to be able to ensure that the restrictions remain in place and that the conservation purpose can be sustained. Because we as organizations have a number of criteria, especially if you're an accredited organization, that are set forward for us by the National Land Trust Alliance. And part of that is to ensure that these open spaces that get set aside in a program like this, that you put a conservation easement on, that they are going to be meaningful in perpetuity. And the example I would use is I get landowners all the time, especially in the urban setting, who say, I have an acre lot, but I want to preserve the back half acre because I see deer here all the time. Well, putting a conservation easement on that back half acre is not going to sustain that deer population. I think most people understand that, but that's what I'm talking about. If we start putting ourselves in that position, there's going to be a question down the road as to whether the conservation purpose is no longer there. It's become impossible or impractical to continue to sustain that. And so that's one of the things I would encourage. There's also other ways when you're dealing with TDRs, if it turns out the land trust doesn't feel that it fits within that conservation purpose test, you can also do various different deed restrictions. We've seen restrictive covenants used. And in that particular instance, you want to make sure you've got some sort of anchor parcel that is in the ownership of the land trust or the entity, similar to that Mapleton example, where they actually own what we would call an anchor parcel so that they can ensure that they have the legal authority to enforce that deed restriction. I think the other thing with respect to TDRs and conservation easements in particular is what I would call double dipping. So it's important to understand that hopefully if you're embarking on a TDR system, you have a fairly uniformly low density so that you can create those incentives that were just talked about for the developer to come in and say, yeah, no, I want to increase the density, cluster the density, there's an incentive there. But one of the things that's important to understand is that going through this process of getting a TDR means that you've already created and given credit for the value. So you can't then, as a developer, for example, come in and go, well, I got all of this credit for the development, and then I got all of this credit for protecting this open space. I want to then additionally take a tax deduction. That is typically what is called quid pro quo. And one of the things that a lot of people don't see is that actually that's something when you were to go and claim a tax deduction, if that's what you were trying to do, there's a supplemental statement that you have to submit to the IRS. And in that, you specifically have to address whether or not you received any bonuses or density, or you received any approvals in conjunction with the conservation easement, because then that's defined as a quid pro quo. And it makes sense. You already got your credit. You can't double dip. I think that the question that was raised by both of the previous speakers and by John's intro to Utah Open Lands is, can the TDRs create long-term community benefit without a deed restriction? And I have to say that unfortunately in my 32 years of working to preserve open space, I have seen homeowner association open spaces that weren't protected. Actually, they failed to pay the property taxes. Those went to a sheriff fire sale. Somebody bought them, and those open spaces that actually got a trade-off, right? The developer got the density, come back in, and somebody goes in and tries to develop that. I've even seen lands that were legislatively protected. Lands where the legislature came out and said, yes, we want to see this protected. It needs to have a conservation easement, it needs to be protected. But politics can change. And so that's one of the things that you need to look at when you're doing these TDRs. I do think that some sort of restriction on that open space long-term is really, really important, because it's a complicated enough process. You don't want to be there 20, 25 years down the road and going, well, wait a minute, can they develop this? So I do think that that becomes a critical component. Next slide. I think that one of the things that's important to understand that land trusts do, but also with respect to various different communities, if, for example, a city was saying, well, hey, we're going to do this TDR program and we're going to be the entity that holds the conservation easement, there really is a definite reality for a land trust, which is that you have to ensure the promise of the terms of those conservation easements. I mean, if you're going to go through the process of doing a TDR, you've made a promise to the community, right? You've gone through that public process. Now you need to make sure that you defend the conservation easement. Conservation easements are not safe from condemnation. However, you still need to defend those conservation easements in the event that there's a threat of condemnation. Utah Open Lands has actually done that 4 times in our history. And each time we've been able to prove that actually, no, there wasn't a need to condemn the conservation easement. You have to look at violations from third parties. And unfortunately, especially when you're working with a homeowners association that's right adjacent to an open space that's been protected, oftentimes they try to privatize public trails that are there. They might create social trails. We've even had instances of people just dumping on the open space, and that becomes really hard to pinpoint who that might be. The other element in terms of defending conservation easements is you can't swap out these landscapes. When you're talking about an individual landowner who's made the commitment to preserve their property, they didn't make that promise, they didn't do that conservation easement thinking that at some point under Utah Open Lands' best judgment, they could go preserve a piece of property in another state. So that's another thing that can't happen with respect to conservation easements. and the IRS has actually issued guidance on this. You can amend a conservation easement, but you cannot amend a conservation easement for development, and you can't amend a conservation easement for curing violations. In fact, it's become very, very clear through a number of articles and guidance issued by the IRS that the only amendment you can do for a conservation easement is to improve, enhance, or make better the conservation purpose for which you protected the property. So with the next slide, I think it comes to basically what I look at as kind of the final frontier, if you will, with respect to conservation easements and protecting some of these open spaces. Again, these properties are a huge value to the community itself. I think earlier we were talking about the actual cost of development. And we have studies from Wasatch County to New York that demonstrate that for every dollar in residential tax money you get, it will cost a community between $1.19 and $1.65 to provide those services. And I think, as it was pointed out, especially if those services are even more spread out. Whereas open space, it's been routinely recognized that even if it's under Greenbelt, for every dollar you get in revenue, it only costs 65 cents. It is a net revenue generator. And that's just the dollars and cents of the landscapes itself. That's not even taking into account the fact that if you look at Bonanza Flat, pictured here with the fall foliage, was basically a lot of leaf peeping that happened this last fall. And what resulted were the towns of Midway and the towns of Park City ended up having the residual people stopping in the cafes, and they saw an economic boost to their community. Again, I mentioned that at the beginning of my presentation. I think the other element that is really important is when you're looking at these landscapes and you're talking about protecting them in perpetuity, they are not only a community resource that you are agreeing to defend and protect, but oftentimes that's where the maintenance begins. And that's one of the reasons that we look at stewardship. That's one of the reasons we now look at a lot of properties that we have and make sure there's a good management plan or the ability to modify that management plan as the landscape changes over time. Working landscapes especially are going to have changes in the regime and the way that they are managed. But all of that is to really take into account the fact that these are not static museum pieces that get protected, even though the conservation easement happens at a point in time. These lands are going to continue to be loved, sometimes overly loved, and we need to protect those conservation values by having a robust conservation easement, a robust baseline documentation, and as I've just mentioned, hopefully having some sort of management plan that is a part of the overall value that you are protecting on this property moving forward, so that you as a community know that you're going to have the resources in perpetuity to protect them. So with that, I'll turn the time back to you all there, and thank you very much.
So, thank you. Is this back on? Yep, it is. Okay. Just thought I'd talk a little bit about a couple examples. The Nibley situation, Nibley process. This is Levi Roberts, city planner, and he has a few tidbits for us. First off, just a little bit about the process. I've talked a little bit about it here as we've gone along, but it is a process, and I'm just going to tie back into Wendy for a minute. Another piece of that process is figuring out how do you preserve those properties permanently, right? It's not just how do you get the credits all together, how do you get to sending, receiving areas, but it's everything. It's including that conservation easement. How's that going to be accomplished? We did a lot of outreach. I think one of the most interesting pieces of this was that we attended the Heritage Days event that they have there every year, had a booth, and just asked one kind of question that was really pretty simple. Are you okay with all those farmers' fields filling in with subdivisions? What do you think the answer was? No, it's not why we moved here. You know, we want that open space to remain. We want that rural heritage to continue. And I think that helped kind of push things through the general process there. We did have a market analysis done, but we did ask the developers what they would be willing to pay for another door. So, a couple lessons learned from Levi. I think in a sense Wendy touched on this, the half-acre idea with the deer in the back, okay? Does it make sense for a land trust to get involved in small parcels, all right? Now, if your farmer has 10 acres or 20 acres, that may not be big enough for a lot of land trusts to get involved. We spent some time talking to the Bear River Land Trust up in that area, and they weren't too sure about doing anything where that small, okay? So the city is really stepping in to try and hold most of those conservation easements. They also have an area next to, I can't remember the name of the creek, anyway, that they want to do a trail system in. And again, there's to me some good reasons for a city to be involved in a trail type area. Let's see. I think it's important that whole communication process and to have a process. It's not just creating an ordinance and you're done. There's a lot to it to educate everybody on this. You'll see that voluntary word again at the end. It's really a tough message. It's a government program. It can't be voluntary, right? You know, you're going to do something to us. That's just not the way this works. It's 100% optional, okay? So they had some good experiences there. And I know I'm not an attorney, and let's see, I was going to ask Gary if he would cover this. Oh, sorry, Gary. Gary and I are old buddies from West Valley. Yeah, so you wondered about the state law, and I said it was basic. All it says is you have to have an ordinance, okay? What would be the point of that? I think I have it in the next line. Yes, it treats everybody the same, all right? Instead of you're negotiating here, and then you did something different over there. And we had an example of that happening in Summit County a while back, which was solved by creation of an ordinance. But they just weren't treating everybody the same. It's just a negotiation here, one there. Who knows how it ends up. You ought to have a purpose in there. You mentioned that also, Chris, and I think that is very important. Why are you doing this? You know, what's the point? Sometimes the mapping stuff can be kind of vague, but you need to think about the maps as another zoning overlay, right? This is our receiving area, we're defining it. This is our sending area, we're defining it. Nice and clear. Talked about negotiation enough, but again, there are communities, and you mentioned this, Chris, too, that seem to think it would be okay to set up this system, and then every time somebody comes in as a developer with those credits, you still negotiate the heck out of the development. It's really important that they get some guarantee they get to develop. And then I'd also suggest, as a planner, that somewhere in your general plan, you talk about this, okay? As opposed to you just came up with it one day and you're not really supported by your general plan. So, a couple things. So, clustering, we talked about that earlier a little bit. We had a presentation by Tim Watkins up in Cache County a month or so ago, maybe a little over. And clustering is an interesting kind of a process. I've heard some communities don't want to do this just because of the concentration that shows up. But in their particular case, they have a really good general plan process that talks right off the bat about the heritage that they want to preserve, okay? If you think about Cache Valley, beautiful farms all over the place, great mountains on both sides, nice communities. What would happen if that all filled in with homes? They didn't want to do that. So they talk about that particular concept. In Nibley, that's the rural heritage that they want to hang on to. Here's this idea, right? So if you got, as I said earlier, 100 acres, you could squish that development down to a corner, or in this case, maybe even the middle. But the farms get to continue around it. Obviously not as much area, but you still get that possibility of the farmer continuing. I want to make that point too, just real fast on TDR. Let's not forget that the owner of a farm or an orchard still gets to do that. They get to do that business that they've been in forever, right? And yet they sell those theoretical development rights. So it's not like you've lost all value of that property. Just a thought. So back to this. You can see that developed out like that with homes on, let's just say those are all 1 acre each. Maybe they're 10 in this example. And that basically takes care of that big open space that you had. Looks a little something like that. But what about that? Is that still a valuable open space, and yet you've got a value out of those homes that are getting built on smaller lots and more affordable than the larger lots? Okay? And then you could get to the point where you could essentially transfer all of that development to one area, or you could start transferring that development to adjacent areas, which would be the TDR concept. Right there. Okay? So there's choices there. Want to talk about one other thing that's happening across the country. How many have an agricultural zone in their community? Yep. Okay, all the ones that I've seen in the past said, what do you get to do on there? You get to do agriculture, and that is it. Okay? You don't get to sell a plant over there. You don't get to sell the soil. You don't get to have a little farm stand out front. You don't get to do anything other than ag. Okay? Why can't we make those properties more flexible in terms of what they can do? So here's a little list. A lot of communities are doing these kinds of things. Bed and breakfast. One of the problems farmers have is getting people to work on the farm, or if you have an orchard, to come pick the fruit, whatever that might be. How do those folks, what kind of housing can they get? Well, could you put some housing on that farm, on that orchard, to serve those temporary workers? Interesting idea. Bed and breakfasts. The other thing I think that's kind of funny, selling things that make sense to go along with the farm. Okay, maybe a tool, maybe a bag of soil or whatever it might be. Those kinds of things. Couldn't they do that kind of thing? Agritourism. Anybody know what that means? Dude. Did you say dude? Dude. He said dude ranches. Well, that might be one. In Wyoming. Okay. Agritourism. Anybody got another little idea on that? How about a slide? Yeah. So all kinds of things can happen on a farm. A lot of these are in orchard areas, but you got wine country, you got dairies that are doing tours and events. All kinds of things can happen if you are more flexible with your agricultural zoning, right? I mean, if it's still just ag only, this stuff doesn't happen. But you can have events, tours, get our high school kids to understand what it means to be a farmer these days, There's a lot of educational things that can be done. And that's happening all over the country and a little bit in our particular state. Quickly going to another one. This one, I think, is a lot simpler, but you gotta have some money to go with this, okay? So this idea, as opposed to TDR, where you're sending credits somewhere, in this particular kind of a system, as a community, you've got some money, such as the Kohler Farm that Wendy mentioned. They got a grant, and they also had a bond in Wasatch County. And they went ahead and bought the development rights. Okay? So they bought them and then they're retired, okay? They're not going somewhere else. They're retired, they're gone, okay? And that's the idea behind this. This takes an incredible amount of community support because you're basically saying, we're gonna raise some taxes to raise some money or figure out some way to raise some money and then buy those development rights, okay? Purchase of development rights. All right. Switching to a slightly different one, overlays. How many have a main street that you're concerned about? Maybe in Hurricane, wherever my Hurricane friends are. Anyway, your main street's changing. You know, you had nice mom and pop shops forever, and now there's McDonald's and Arby's and whatever else that just doesn't really fit into the character that you've got. A lot of communities are going to overlays for those, trying to preserve their community character through design, all right? So requiring different design features to make that happen. Doing different things to the streetscape to make it more friendly to pedestrians. Outdoor dining, all those kinds of things that just don't happen unless you allow them, right? And try and push them that direction. I think the design ordinances really can help with our older downtowns, and that's all I'll try to cover at the moment. So, I hope you've learned something about transfer of development rights, TDR, land trust, or conservation easements that will help ensure that permanent open space. Clustering, okay, is an option, and again, you're going to need some kind of a mechanism of permanency for that open space that's preserved there. Flexible agricultural zones, purchase of development rights, overlays, and do we have any big questions from the chat room? I was wondering about that. No chat. Oh well. So three resources that you want to keep in mind. Chris is the main author of this handbook. Again, if you want to read and understand about TDR, this is the resource you ought to be using.
John?
Yep.
Just one comment. We are monitoring the Q&A. The chat's not active, but if those online have a question, please pose it in the Q&A.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. For the conservation easements and land trusts, I would suggest going to Wendy's site, okay? But there's also a National Land Trust Alliance that has even more information on those. Again, it's a key component to preserving that open space. All right. I don't have much more. So, what else would you like to talk about? Anything in particular on that? John?
So if you were to buy development rights,
Can you use
Yeah, sorry, we're trying to,
people online?
yeah.
If you were to buy the development rights, how would you document that to make it, to preserve it? How would that be different than a conservation type trust?
So, what we're seeing, and Chris may want to add to this, make some room, is that there's actually a new document called a deed of severance. Okay, so you're severing out those development rights. That's recorded. And I think the online thing might work, but we have to understand the city's got to be able to track all of that in some manner, which probably does work. But deed of severance is what that's been called. That's what Nibley's using. That's what Spanish Fork is looking at also. Does that make sense? And they've actually got a little canned form that lays that out. So again, treating everybody the same with those.
So you can grant those development rights to the city as a grantee on the deed, isn't that what you're saying?
Not exactly. Those development rights go to the developer, right? They are the folks that receive those to use for that receiving area.
No, I'm talking.
Okay, sorry. I didn't understand.
I'm talking about purchasing the development rights. You said that's one of the approaches.
Oh, in PDR, yeah. So that one I'm not as familiar with. I believe the thought would be similar, and those somehow, that's a different document than the deed of severance in my mind, because it's going to say something about those are retired and gone, as opposed to in TDR they're going to be used somewhere else. Okay, haven't done one of those. So maybe Wendy's still there. She might have heard of some of that. So, other thoughts? Yeah.
I'll wait for her.
Hold on, where are you?
She's working hard, we gotta let her get there. I got two questions. First off, where's the best place to buy your TDR handbook? You've got one left on Amazon at $126.
I'll go 100.
You literally have one softback TDR handbook left on Amazon for $126 and no hardback available.
The publisher is Routledge. So go to the Routledge, ROUTLEDGE. Go to their website. The book was published by the American Planning Association, and then Routledge Publishers now manages all of the APA's publications. Or you could probably go to the APA website too and look for it. But yeah, I would go to one of those two places. They're the actual publishers.
I was just laughing, $126 on Amazon, one copy. Second question,
Is it the
has this ever
hardbound
been,
version?
have you guys seen this clustering idea and a planned urban development overlay used more like you get somebody's coming in, they want to develop 600 acres, it's all developed, it's all zone R1. You say, if you'll put the whole thing in this corner, 100 acres, and give up your rights to all the rest, we'll let you go to, 5 per acre. Does that work?
I was going to mention something and then I didn't, but now I will since you asked me. Years ago, I was a consultant for a master plan community in Florida, and wow, I guess I shouldn't use Florida as the example. And the developer was going to do standard cookie cutter stuff. And I said, well, and he was receptive. I said, well, what if you clustered this stuff? It was a combination low land, some wetland and so forth, but he had a way to get like 3-acre home sites out of this 80 acres or something as part of a 1,000-acre master plan community. So I said, well, what if you took this high ground here and put all the potential units you could on the 80 acres here? And he said, well, we don't make any money on that. And we actually got a hold of an appraiser. We chatted about the market and everything else. And it turned out in this particular situation, people would pay more per lot for a half acre, actually not even half acre, a third of an acre, than they would by having a 3-acre lot. They would pay more for that 1/3 acre if they knew the rest of the 80 acres was their playground, their open space, all private reserve. And that sold the developer.
Okay.
And it is an interesting thing to think about. When you cluster that development, you have fewer roads, fewer infrastructure, pipes, whatever it might be, less sidewalk to put in, all of that, which is a benefit to the community, but it's also a benefit to the developer, right? Their development costs are less. I know we've had maybe a conversation about this in the past, at least I heard we did. But you could also do a planned unit development in doing that, I would think, too. But you'd have to have both of these ordinances sitting out there and available to you.
I promise my last one.
Okay.
The biggest thing we're seeing in these smaller communities, Panguitch, Kanab, Orderville, I don't know who else here. I'm all south, so anybody up north, sorry. You don't really have anywhere to transfer this stuff into because most of your inside the city limits is privately owned. And just to run an overlay over the top of somebody that's not willing to sell the property that we're gonna move these rights from here to here, but where we're moving them, they don't want to sell anyway. So you get zero development. And I've always said development isn't really controlled by the city, it's controlled by those who are able to buy property and want to spend the money to create the development. And we can't always control where that is because we don't know who's going to sell and we don't know when they're going to sell. So just something of this nature where we could take, just like you did in Florida, that's a huge tool. If somebody comes to us with 700 acres they want to develop and we say, well, how about we let you high density develop this 150 and you guarantee to leave the rest untouched, that could be really, maybe even a more useful tool simply because we don't control who's going to spend and who's going to buy and when they're going to do it.
I think that's a good point. This sort of illustrates that. One of the things that can happen is several property owners can come together and create that cluster together. Okay, it doesn't have to be just one property.
Great idea. As soon as they know this is available.
Yeah. Well, and I think, again, that takes an ordinance to make that happen, but that is happening. Yep, great.
John, just want to bring attention to a comment that Wendy Fisher just made online. She says purchasing development rights can be done in a similar way to a conservation easement, and the process is often the same. Some have used a restricted covenant, but it would need to include the ability to have an anchor parcel to ensure the ability to enforce the restricted covenant on the property. And if it is not a conservation easement, it might not be protected forever.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Other thoughts?